Hello friends, my name is Dr. Robert. I have a PhD on the Beatles and my topic is their lyric. Today is the first of two parts of how you analyze a Beatles lyric. I'm going to explain the process and the theoretical issues with it and also give you a few examples. I must be the only person I know, actually I am, who has a PhD but did not set out to have a PhD. What happened was, during the 90s, I began researching the Beatles rather intensely. Once I discovered that there is a whole secret code in the Beatles, as Paul McCartney has recently put it, or what I call a private conversation in the public domain that runs across their songs as they talk to each other or about each other and about other people occasionally. And I thought, this is so radically different from anything you can read about the Beatles that I need to validate myself academically. Now, I already had 3 degrees, so I was comfortable with universities, and I approached Monash University, which is one of Australia's highest standing universities, and its largest, but it also happens to be the one nearest to where I live. And I told them what I'd done, and they looked at my work and they said, fine, what you need to do is first enroll in a postgraduate degree on the philosophy and practice of history, and then we'll enroll you into the master's program and you can do a thesis and we'll evaluate it and you'll be given 2 supervisors. I did the degree on history, which I loved, and then I was given 2 supervisors, Dr. Mark Peel and Dr. Liz Reed, both of whom I found fantastic, just greatly supportive. And we began this process in the master's degree, and within a month they said to me, we need to upgrade you to a PhD because your work is too big and too important. And so that's why I've got a PhD. I have validated my work academically, and I'm going to explain to you the approach and the challenges that you have to have if you want to analyze the Beatles lyrics or any poetry, any prose, any major piece of literature with the degree of rigor, plus the specific challenges in the Beatles. I'm going to start just with a quote. I mentioned last week that I grew up on Engelbert Humperdinck and his opera Hansel and Gretel, and I had the 1953 edition and I have it still on disc, and I have the original libretto, which includes an essay by his son Wolfram Humperdinck, and it opens with these words in English: "In the work of any creative man, we can find reflections of a part of his being, impressions of his life that speak to us. Conversely, we often learn to understand the products of his art better the more familiar we become with his life and personal attributes." And I love that duality. We see in the songs of a person impressions of their life, of their values, of their attitudes, and they speak to us. But also, the more we do study and look at his art, the more familiar we become with his life and his personal attributes. And that's what we're going to find with the Beatles. I'm just going to briefly introduce you to the basic way of learning. Now, this is Bloom's taxonomy. It was commissioned by the United Nations in the mid-50s. In 1956, Professor Bloom of Chicago University created this 5-point approach to how you teach anything. It's now been expanded to 6 points. I switch it around and I say, this is how you analyze anything. I'm going to use the original language because it's better. First step is to find the facts. You need to know the history of the Beatles. This is where a person like Mark Lewisham is so valuable, because all the chronology, all the details, as much as you can, you need to be familiar with them. And then the second one he called comprehension, which is understand here. And what he meant by comprehension was that when you found the facts, try and reformulate them in your own language so that you can explain them to other people. And that's the 2 lower level thinking skills. The rest of the thinking skills are higher level. The third one is apply. You know, it's one thing to read an instruction manual, and then it's a second thing and an altogether different thing to go out and do it. And that's what apply means, is that when you found the facts, so If I tell you this is how you analyze the Beatles, then you say, oh, okay, I understand it. I'm going to do. And that now you're going to apply it on your first song. So application is a higher level thinking skill. You have to use a lot more. The next step is analyze. And how Bloom's described it was you break the song, into all its component parts, musical and literary, and you understand how each contributes to the whole. So it's not only decomposition, but it's also the interconnectedness of it and the creating of a whole from it. And that is a profound way of describing analysis. When you look at analysis of a problem, you always have to understand every little bit about it and why it's important or why it's not important or not all that important or whatever. And the last step was called synthesize, which here is called create. And synthesize says, now that I understand this thing and I understand all the component parts to it and how they work together to make it, can I do something different with this? Now, this is the classic Lego thing. You get a Lego set, you build it, follow the instructions, and you build it. So that's the apply. Then you analyze it, and you look at some of these sets nowadays have amazing designs, and you look at those designs and the engineering in some of them, particularly the more complex Technic sets, and you understand them, and then you try and do it yourself. In a new context, you create. That was the ultimate step in the original Bloom's, and I added judge after that, because I thought after you've done that, after you've created your own work, you're in a position where you can judge your work and you can judge the others. They've added evaluate, which is the same thing earlier in the piece. After analysis, you evaluate, then you create. I suppose it's okay. But anyway, that's the basics in which we're going to go. I'm going to teach you the facts. You can understand them. You should then apply them, analyze them, see what you think. You will know facts that I don't know. So you may be able to throw new light on some of the songs that I don't know, because you literally can't know all the facts in a thing like as complex as the Beatles. So this is why we're splitting the introductory session into two, because it has two. The first question we have to ask is, how do you analyze the past? And that's part one, this part. The second part, which will follow, is how to analyze a text. That's part two. And for both part one and part two, we need to be aware of special considerations required for the Beatles. And these I will be supplying you both in part one and in part two. But before we jump in, I thought I'm going to start with Beatles tribute songs. And then I'll start analyzing a couple of Beatles tribute songs so that you can kind of get the gist of where we're going. The Beatles tribute songs are a phenomenon particular to the United States. Their first single in the United States was I Want to Hold Your Hand. It had 7 weeks at the top. And on its third week at the top, She Loves You joined it at number 2. And it stayed in that number 2 position for another 4 weeks, so 5 weeks in all, at number 2, before replacing I Want to Hold Your Hand at the top for 2 weeks. And that was in turn replaced by the Beatles' brand new single, Can't Buy Me Love, for about 5 weeks, I think it was. So that was an immensely long period of time, but also the only time in the history of the US Billboard charts where one artist has had 3 consecutive number ones. It's never been done before or since. On that third week of I Want to Hold Your Hand, the first Beatles tribute song appeared on the US charts, and it was by Donna Lynn, and it's called My Boyfriend Got a Beatle Haircut. And poor old Donna, she's exasperated. She's so distressed about this because my boyfriend got a Beatles haircut. Oh, unhappy day. My boyfriend got a Beatles haircut. Now I can't chase the girls away. 2 weeks later, one of those girls got onto the charts. The Swans, they sang The Boy with the Beatles Haircut, and these lusty swans were after that boy. And so the 2 first Beatles tribute songs are the 2 sides of the same coin. How amazingly sexy and attractive and wild and free this new hairstyle that the Beatles were introducing was. And oh my gosh, my boyfriend's followed it. Oh, it's such a nightmare. And then the other guy, oh my goodness, he's got a Beatles haircut. He's awesome. Yes, but most of the tribute songs in those early days would surprise you today, but not if you knew your facts. So the fact of the matter is that when the Beatles arrived in New York City on that day in 1964, there were 20,000 people waiting for them. Now, the largest they've ever had in terms of airport receptions in the UK was around 10,000. And Ringo just looked at it and said, they must be mad. And when they went into the arrivals hall, there were 5,000 people in the arrivals hall, and there was a whole bunch of journalists, and they were expected to give an impromptu news interview so that the journalists could ask them questions and they'd answer. And the Beatles were on top form for that. One of the funniest questions was the inevitable one, when did you have a haircut? And George sardonically responded, we had one yesterday. And they all just laughed. And then Ringo piped up, you should have seen him the day before. And this is how it was. Ringo kind of like all of a sudden found his groove when they arrived in America on that day and never lost it. And because he was the ordinary Joe in this extraordinary circumstance, and yet he was handling it with such competence, such good grace and humour, the United States fell in love with him, of all the Beatles. So the first Ringo's tribute song is called We Love You Beatles by the Carefrees, who singled out Ringo for first mention. And this is what they said to him. No matter where you go, we'll follow you. When you're not near us, we're blue. The Young World Singers had a song called Ringo for President, but my personal favourite of all the Ringo songs was one by Bonnie Jo Mason. And she sang, Ringo, I love you, yeah, yeah, yeah. Ringo, I love you. Bonnie Jo had a husky voice, and many US radio stations thought it was a gay man's pretending to be a woman making a gay tribute to the Beatles, and so they shunned it, and it was banned on many radio stations. But it in fact was a woman. It was Cher. On her very first single, she sang a Beatles tribute song. Now her real name is Sherilyn, so Cher is not a nom de plume, but Bonnie Jo Mason most certainly is. The most famous Ringo tribute song is one we'll find out when it reaches the UK in May 1964. It's an incredible song. It's one of the most important songs in popular music, and I guarantee you that almost no one has ever thought of it as a Beatles tribute song. In fact, the next three songs I'm going to talk about are all super famous, and not one of them will you have thought of as a Beatles tribute song. And I'll be presenting my reasons. And of course, you're free to disagree. That's a given. So the first one is a song by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Now, the Beatles had recorded Smokey Robinson's You've Really Got a Hold on Me on their second album with the Beatles. And they did such a fantastic job of it. They fully understood the two meanings in the song. The one that you have to put in to get away with saying the other one that you're not allowed to say in those days. And they totally nailed it. They understood it. It was clear they understood it. And more than that, there's a niggling little change that John made to the lyric to show Smokey that he objected to his lax grammar. And when Smokey heard it, this is what he said. When they recorded You Really Got a Hold on Me, and it's interesting because I said the song had a different title, and so it did. When they recorded You Really Got a Hold on Me, it was one of the most flattering things that ever happened to me. That shows he understood John Lennon's little finicky grammar joke, by the way, if you look into it. I listened to it over and over again, not to criticize it, but to enjoy it. I first met them at a private club in London, the White Elephant, and they were not only respectful for us, and this for a black man in, the early 60s was pretty much something. They were downright worshipful, and that's from Steve Turner's The Complete Beatles Songs, page 50. So some tribute was surely due. And what happened at the Christmas party in 1966 for Motown Records, little Stevie Wonder came up to Smokey and said, I've written this piece of music that I'd like you to help me turn into a song. And so Smokey did that, and it became Tears of a Clown. And it was placed on their 1967 album, but it was just an album track. And then Smokey, in 1970, he decided he was done with singing music. He was going to become a Motown executive full-time. And when the British Motown people got wind of it, they thought, oh my gosh, he's so popular here. We have to see if we can get one more single out of him. So they went through the back catalogue and they came up with Tears of a Clown. And so they released it as a single, and it was a huge #1 hit there. The USA saw what happened, the Motown people there, and they said, well, let's see if it does the same thing here. They released it, and it was a #1 there as well. And that was his last #1. Tears of a Clown suggests the Beatles in several ways. The first way is Ringo's great drum fill in the middle of I Feel Fine, which really drives the song into its second half. They use that drum fill repeatedly in Tears of a Clown. So that's a strong pointer, but the song opens with, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That touches on both She Loves You, their most famous song up to that point in time, and also it's B-side, I'll Get You. So She Loves You goes, yeah, 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 she loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'll Get You starts with, oh yeah, oh yeah. And here we have, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So it does both the A and B side. But its theme is the same theme as we find in the song John Lennon wrote, I'm a Loser. And John said that this was his first song which was really personal. And he describes himself as a sad clown. And his problems that cause him to be sad all originate in his pride. In other words, he has caused the situation. So Smokey does the same thing. He describes himself as a sad clown, and his problems are caused by pride. So that's why I think Tears of a Clown is a Beatles tribute song. It's an inference, it's not a proof. It's an inference, but it's a close inference. A tribute was due, a tribute was given. The next one, again, you will not have considered this a Beatles tribute song, is December 1963, Oh What a Night by the Four Seasons. And the reason is different, because we can actually go to the songwriter, Bob Gaudio, and his wife Judy Parker helped him write the lyrics, but he wanted to base his song on the day the United States lost its virginity. And he chose the day that Prohibition ended, when the United States was once again allowed to have alcohol, and they had the wildest, biggest party ever on that night. But his bandmate Frankie Valli objected. It's way too far back in time, no one will get it. So the only possible alternative day when the United States lost its virginity was December 1963, when the Beatles suddenly arrived and bang, or should we say splash, everything happened. And this is from Song Facts, where you can find this quote. The song also relates to the woman who became his wife, Judy, in that their first sexual encounter was wonderful. It was transformative. And so it deals with both of these things. It deals with the Beatles, and it deals with his first sexual encounter with his wife. But it is mainly uses an analogy of sex to describe the impact of the Beatles. Oh, what a night. What a very special time for me, as I remember, what a night. You know, I didn't even know her name, but I was never going to be the same. What a lady, what a night. That is one of the cleverest lines ever written about the name The Beatles. Because we take it for granted now, but it is, I think, both the stupidest, silliest, and most intelligent name that's ever been devised for a group. Because there are at least 5 different meanings that I use for Beatles. And it takes you all sorts of ways that are all relevant to the group. And I'll talk about those 5 meanings when we do Love Me Do. I was never going to be the same. And I didn't even know her name. It's very much like me. When I heard the Beatles, I didn't know their name either. I just was blown away by the music. I got a funny feeling as she walked into the room. And as I recall, it ended much too soon. Now, that's not the sex. That's the song. It was only 2 minutes and 7 seconds long, but, you know, by the time you've had the first 7 or 8 seconds, the way just already then you're exhausted because it's so exciting. So, yes, but the next verse is the verse that can only be about his girlfriend or to-be wife. Oh, what a night, hypnotizing, mesmerizing me. She was everything I thought she'd be. Sweet surrender, what a night. But then we go and we come back to the analogy of the record. And I felt a rush like a rolling bolt of thunder, spinning my head around and taking my body under. And this has to be a musical line because it uses this word, rolling thunder. And as you know, if you know anything about the song, it was recorded 1 month after Bob Dylan began his Rolling Thunder tour. And so he's introducing not just the Beatles, but those who came in their wake. And the spinning his head around, this is the single, as well as a sexual thing. It runs, sex and music run in parallel along the whole of this song. It's not about one thing. I got a funny feeling when she walked in the room. As I can recall, it ended much too soon. Why did it take me so long to see the light? Seemed so wrong, but now it seems so right. And this is playing again into John Lennon and his concerns about Christian morality. What seems so wrong can be so inflexible, but things like sex are just so wonderful. And John played that very game in songs like Girl to make an oblique criticism of Christian values in his song. So they do that. But the song I'm going to focus on is a song I first heard as sung by the Carpenters, and I loved it. It's called Superstar. And already in Superstar, the title, I thought, okay, it doesn't tell you who they're singing about, but it's telling you something about a person whose stardom is beyond stardom. And in 1969, when that song was written, that could only really have applied to the Beatles, whose stardom was unimaginably beyond stardom. That's why in 1971, when Jesus Christ Superstar came out, Jesus Christ was that kind of a person whose celebrity, whose fame was just beyond fame. So already in that title, it kind of restricts you if you historicize it. But the thing that really made me say, okay, it is the Beatles, was the last line in the second verse, where he talks about hearing your sad guitar. And the Beatles, of course, super famous for their sad guitar, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, one of their great anthems. And so that said to me, yes, it's likely to. And then I did an analysis and I saw all the different ways that it could be about the Beatles. One of the stronger other ways is I fell in love with you before the second show. Now, the Beatles were unique because Brian Epstein had restricted them to having half-hour sets, and that's all. So when they went to a town, they frequently had 2 shows in the night. They had another band or two introduce them, and then they came on and did their half-hour set. So this was probably in St. Louis, where I fell in love with you before the second show. But there were several places in the United States when they first toured there that they did 2 shows. And we see again the guitar. And so you're getting a sense, it's not just about the Beatles, but it's about George Harrison, because with 2 mentions of your guitar, one of them being your sad guitar, we're starting to think that lines. But, you know, there are 2 possible mentions of McCartney. Don't you remember, you told me you love me, baby. Now, millions of people have sung I love you songs. Millions, literally. So initially that doesn't seem to be specific. But Paul McCartney has sung the 2 most important love you songs that ever were recorded. And the first one is on his first single, P.S. I Love You. He goes, I love you. And it's a rising glory across a flattened major 6th, flattened major 7th, and then the tonic 8th, or one home chord. And that chord sequence had never been found in any song ever before then. Music theoreticians have looked at it and they have found one instance where it occurred in another place, but it's essentially a Paul McCartney invention. No one has ever said I love you more creatively than that. But the definitive I love you is not that one. It's from Michel, where he goes, I love you, I love you, I love you. That's all I want to say. And that closing thing makes it the strongest, most deliberated I love you that's ever been said. So I looked at that and said, yes, it could be Paul. But then you said you'd be coming back this way again, baby. And here, you know, I've alerted you already, if you've seen the previous videos, an awkwardly worded sentence by someone who had all the time in the world to get the sentence right. So who said they'll be coming back? Well, John Lennon, he sang the song, I'll Be Back. And so I'm looking at those two and say, yeah, that could be the Beatles. And then also, last of all, loneliness is such a sad affair. Eleanor Rigby is the greatest song about loneliness that's ever been written, arguably. And so I thought, yeah, it does sound like the Beatles. And then earlier this year, for some very strange reason, I felt I need to talk about the song to my Beatles class. And it turned out at exactly the right time, and I'll go through why now. I need to dig, because that's not digging, that's just a close reading. That's only one little part of how you analyze a song. And so I dug, and I found out that the song already existed on Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen, and it was sung by one of his backing singers. She, Ruta Coolidge, was given the opportunity to sing one song, and she sang this song. And I didn't notice at that time the differences. I wasn't as impressed with her version as I was with the Carpenters. But then I discovered that it was written by Bonnie Bramlett and Leon Russell. And then bells went off, because I know who Bonnie Bramlett is. Bonnie Bramlett is part of Delaney and Bonnie, a husband and wife team that were US based and had a recording contract in California. And in January 1969, George Harrison discovered them, or was introduced to them, heard their music, saw Bonnie's picture, and was so taken by the two things that he decided to go to the United States immediately after finishing the Get Back sessions and meet with them. And when he got there, he must have fallen in love with Bonnie, because he invited them to come over to the UK in the middle of the year, just after Abbey Road was finished, and perform with him live. Then he told his best friend Eric Clapton. And so he and Eric went on tour with Delaney and Bonnie and friends in Europe after Abbey Road. And as you can see, they produced an LP based on that. George was actually wearing a sombrero throughout the concert so that people didn't recognize who he was, but he loved playing live. The only thing he didn't like about live playing with the Beatles was the crazy fans and the fact that they couldn't even be heard. But given the opportunity, there he was. And it was such a success that he went back with them again, as did Eric, at the end of the year for their second round of European concerts. And from that one came the famous live album. There is a strong connection between George and Bonnie. And now we can look at the song in its original form. And you'll note that Karen Carpenter made two changes to it. She changed the title to Superstar, and she changed one line. And they're rather decisive. I can hardly wait to sleep with you again. And then she says a truly dirty line. What to say? To make you come again. And it wasn't at all dirty in its original context. And she calls herself, the song's titled, Groupie now. Its original title, its actual title. So Karen Carpenter changed that one line to have Be With You Again, not Sleep With You Again, and changed the title to Superstar. But it's groupie brackets superstar because she is a groupie, but only for superstars. When you read biographies of George Harrison, such as this new one by Philip Norman, you discover that Delaney, Bonnie's husband, was wild with jealousy about what was going on those tours, and she, on more than one occasion, was severely bruised by his battering. Their marriage only lasted until 1971. It's surprising it lasted as long as that, actually. So this distressing event, Philip Norman says, caused George to kind of withdraw and be shocked. And maybe so, because apparently it looks as if he was part of the problem. So this is a pretty good reason for believing that Superstar was concerned with George Harrison and as a Beatles tribute song. it's got a sad ending to it, doesn't it? And the song that Bonnie Bramlett, she records, it's a terrific version. It stands right up next to the Carpenters. It's different, but it's great. And the last thing I'll say about it is that at the end of January, just before his visit to the United States, George came up with this new song called Old Brown Shoe. The Old Brown Shoe, he's stepping out this Old Brown Shoe, that's the Beatles. It's one of his many Beatles hating songs at the time, you know, All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, songs like that, Old Brown Shoe. And he said, I want a short-haired girl who sometimes wears it twice as long. Of course, this is just a supposition, but very few women in those days wore their hair short, and Bonnie Bramlett was one of them. So now we all look at how you analyse the past. There are three views with how you deal with the past. And the first one, the one that used to be just a given, is that historians just tell the story about the past. There is a story about the past, the historians research and discover it, and then they tell it. It died in around 1960 when it was felt that this only tells one side of the story, and just about every past has multiple sides. And so the role of the historians became to explore the past and to develop propositions or arguments about the past based on various perspectives on the past. And I say this is how I describe that kind of history, the kind that we lived with since then. History is the collection of substantiated arguments about the past. And the second approach requires a great deal of work in going through the archives, researching the documents, everything like that, to provide your substantiation. In recent times, the role of historians has changed to be more about judging the past rather than exploring the past. And ideological approaches have grown in importance, and you will probably find yourself thinking along those lines because it's very much the flavour of today. I am going to be exposing many difficult things about the Beatles, but my intention is not to shame them or humiliate them or to criticise them even. It is only to understand them and to deepen our understanding of them. What you make with what I go through is entirely up to you, but my aim is true. I wish to explore and understand the Beatles and share my understanding with you. That's it. So, how do you analyse the past? And now we come to the core of historical method. All histories since 1960 thereabouts are arguments about the past. That doesn't mean I'm arguing with you. An argument is just putting forward a point of view in an academic sense. And they're substantiated by evidence, these arguments. And historians call these evidences sources. All historical arguments bounce between facts, the known, proven things, and inferences, things that we can conclude. Now, what I have just gone through, those last three songs, started with a large inference, less inference, more implication, and the last one, almost entirely implication, almost no inference. I've sort of graduated them towards implication from inference. But when you're dealing with texts, with what people said, what people say in an interview, what people are writing down, whatever it is, you are dealing with an interpretation. In other words, you're inferring things. You have to justify your reading. Now, there's a priority of these sources that we should consider. The main sources are primary sources in historical terminology, and those are the people who are actually involved. For us, that's the 6 Beatles. 5 of them have left written information. I'm including Pete Best in that. And the 6th one, Stuart Sutcliffe, has not left us anything other than his pictures. So if we wanted to explore Stuart's life, you may be able to find a few letters, you will be able to find some pictures, and you'll make of it what you will, but that's all he's left us. But the other Beatles have left us plenty of things to look at, to explore. All the interviews they gave, all the special statements they made in their authorised biographies and things like that. There's plenty of stuff to look at. Secondary sources are statements by witnesses who were there, but they didn't do the main creative bit. And I've got a group. I've listed in the slide groupings of witnesses. The first grouping is the people who were with the Beatles in the recording studio when they recorded their music, such as George Martin. The second group is people who belonged to their family circles, such as John's wife Cynthia Lennon. The third group is people who were their friends, such as John's best friend Pete Shotton. The fourth group is people who belonged to their management circle, such as Brian Epstein. The fifth group is their musical friends and buddies, such as the Rolling Stones. And the sixth group is journalists who knew them well and had hung out with them over many hours, such as Ray Coleman. We could put Maureen Cleave there, or Michael Brown. These people are strong secondary sources. Tertiary sources are documentaries, such as Beatles documentary, The Complete Beatles. Books, there are thousands of books about the Beatles, and other statements by commentators and expert opinions such as me. I'm a tertiary source. So in the priority, you should give priority to primary sources. If you've got good reasons not to, you resort to secondary sources, and if you've got good reasons not to, you resort to tertiary sources. But tertiary sources are always interesting because they are informed opinions. So that's the priority in which we deal with sources. In general also, for especially the primary and secondary sources, private statements are more trustworthy than published statements. So what the Beatles tell us in interviews are always designed for an audience and for a time, and they have a particular thing they wish to communicate. Whereas private statements are, there's not necessarily the same ambition in them. And there are two private statements in the Beatles that are relevant, because mostly the Beatles didn't keep diaries, they weren't great letter writers, so we don't have much to go on. One is a tape recording that John Lennon made in 1979, September 1979. He was apparently thinking about putting together an autobiography, and this one particular tape recording is a very important private statement because he recorded it for his own purposes only. It was discovered after he died. The second one is an interview that Paul and Linda McCartney gave in 1984 to Playboy magazine, where Linda told us something that he had told her, and it was about 8 days a week. So that makes it an important private statement because he loved her and there was no need for him to deceive her. She knew everything about him. Whereas his later statement to us, which contradicts that statement, you would be foolish if you regarded it as important. It's not. So here we come to an interesting fact. I have two versions of this book, the famous book by Ian MacDonald, one of the greatest Beatles commentators. The edition number 1, and the one that came out after Anthology, and it's augmented, as you can see, a lot thicker, edition number 3. Edition number 1 records about 8 days a week what Linda mentioned in the 1984 interview. Edition number 3 does not mention what Linda said, but only talks about what Paul said in 1997 in his authorized biography. He does not have the integrity to tell us, to alert us to the fact that Paul told us a majorly different version of the events, that dials Ringo's star out of the equation. Ringo's the equation for 8 days a week, according to Linda, who he was told in confidence in private, and she blurted it out in an interview. Why is Ringo not there? Would you believe that one over this one? No historian would. And the fact that Ian MacDonald doesn't even alert us to the fact that he's changed his story when Paul changed his story shows us the extent to which you can't trust an important tertiary source. This is one of the most important ones. We have the same thing with one of the other most important second tertiary sources, Steve Turner's 2 books. As I said earlier, this one, A Hard Day's Right, came out first, It's been extended and censored in a number of critical ways to remove things that are embarrassing that he didn't remove in his first version. And it has the same problem with 8 days a week. Here we have Ringo. Here we don't. We don't even know why Paul changed his mind, because if we've only got this copy, we'd not even know that Paul changed his mind. He also doesn't have the integrity to alert his readers to the fact that Paul McCartney doesn't maintain his stories over time. And so the tertiary sources are just as unreliable as the primary sources. Everywhere in the Beatles, I've already used one, Philip Norman, today, who says that George Harrison was greatly troubled by seeing Bonnie bruised and having to cancel concerts. How did you know that? George never said that in any interview. He made it up. I mean, it's reasonable to suppose so, but he made it up. Such as source analysis. If you don't do source analysis, if you don't look at the trustworthiness of sources, you can't function as a historian. Now, we already knew, without me being involved, if you have a good reading across the Beatles, you would already be aware that the Beatles are extremely untrustworthy sources when they talk about themselves or the past or their music. Indeed, there came a book about, was it 10 or so years ago, maybe 2015, something like that, The Beatles and the Historians. It's not really about the historians. What it's about is how the Beatles have changed their stories over the times. And looks at the Beatles up to their split. Literally, Abbey Road, they're still telling the same story, where they're basically writing all these songs about, I'm getting out of the Beatles, I'm so happy it's over, and stuff like that. They still united, wonderful team. Oh, Paul did a great job. And, you know, they don't criticize each other at all. And it's the flavour of their authorised biography from 1968, which was researched through interviews in 1967, which is why I sometimes refer to it as a 67 book, because it's dated to that end of 67. When John Lennon had his first big interview in 1970 after the Beatles ended in April that year, he just tore into the Beatles. He said, we were nothing like that book. It was all lies. But when you get a new copy of that book, The Beatles by Hunter Davies, the authorised biography, he now includes about 70 pages of explanations of how John Lennon and his aunt in particular demanded that they cut out this, that they cut out that, and he's got all sorts of indications in that to say, this is why the book was what it was, and I wanted to write a different book, but I wasn't allowed to. It was John, and yet John is the first one to tear into it, say, oh, it was rubbish, it was all lies. The only true book was Love Me Do by Michael Braun from 1964. He followed them for 3 months or so, maybe even more, maybe 4 months, in 63, 64. That was the only true book, he said. The other one was just lies. And so the Beatles manufacture story according to John. And then he's got this new story about, no, we were much more competitive, and really I was much more important than I'm given credit for, and so and so and so. And then he got more and more angry over the years. So even comparing his 1970 interview to his 1980 interview, where he's got a whole decade of Paul McCartney's mind-blowing successes, and he's had a relatively dismal solo career, and he's got more and more bitter, and comparing to what he said between his interviews across the decades shows how John changed over the decade. But Paul only spoke about 2 songs during the time John was alive, and that was Nowhere Man and In My Life. And he said, no, I wrote the music for those. And so in his last interview, John said, oh, he didn't even say, no, Paul's lying. He just said, I wrote the music for that. And he tried to justify it by pointing to another song he claims to have written the music for, which is If I Fell. Now, we know that he had the melody, but he didn't have the amazing chord structure when we hear the demo of If I Fell. And so he gets the chord structure wrong when he tries to say they had the same chords. They didn't have the same chords, and the chords he mentions aren't in either of those songs. So it looks as if he had nothing to do with the actual fundamental chord structure in If I Fell, and therefore also Paul, what he said I wrote the music for In My Life. It's more plausible, but that's the nature of John. So Paul didn't even dare to criticize him or to disagree with him while he was alive. And in 1984, he does this first big interview with Playboy magazine, and he talks about 37 of their songs. And there's about a 36 or 34% disagreement rate more than a third of the songs John said it was this way and Paul said no, it was that way. And by the time he gets to do his authorized biography in 1997, there's a more than 50% disagreement rate. And when he does his big review of his whole life in the lyrics in 2021, again, different stories across the years between 97 and 2021. There's different stories between 1984 and 1997. So Paul changes his story quite frequently, but no one's there to defend John's position. So I'll be looking at what they say, and then I'll be looking at the songs. But can you trust the Beatles when they talk about their songs? Absolutely not. But you have to look at it because there's as much information about the songs in there as the dynamic between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. We will learn a lot when we look at their stuff, but you can't just trust it. Can you trust their famous chronologist, Mark Lewisham, when he talks about the Beatles? He's the Beatles brain of Britain, he calls himself. And his book, The Complete Beatles Session, is, as I've said, my most important book that I use. He is phenomenally good at researching the facts of the Beatles. When they did that, what they did, who was involved. He's brilliant at that. And his book, Tune In, is also an amazing book in terms of the facts. But Tune In breaks the rules of history, and you can see that he's not a historian, because he favours his own obscure secondary sources who were scarcely there over the people who were there. And the classic example, I could just roll off a whole bunch, but the classic one is the tragic day when John's father had taken him from his Aunt Mimi for a holiday to Blackpool 3 weeks ago, and he hadn't returned. And so Aunt Mimi, who had no custody, but he was living with her, got his mum, Julia, to go to Blackpool with her boyfriend, Bobby Dykins, to retrieve John. So Julia rocks up. She has a meeting with John in the front room of the house where they're staying. The friend isn't in the meeting, can't hear anything about the meeting. Halfway through, the parents can't work out what to do. So the father, who's a real idiot, Fred, he says, why don't we get John to come in and tell us? So they get this little 5-year-old, and he doesn't even understand. This is either mummy or daddy, and he's only had about 4 weeks of his father, maybe 5 weeks in his whole life. The last 5 weeks, the 3 weeks in Blackpool, and the 2 or so weeks before that when Fred rocks up just as Julia's moving out with her new boyfriend into the new flat. So he doesn't even understand. It's either mummy or daddy because we're not going to be together. So John chooses his father, and then Julia just packs a bag and says, well, goodbye, gives him a kiss and walks out the door. And then John, in horror, just shouts, Mummy, Mummy, I'm coming. He runs after her. And that's the story that Fred recorded. Now, Fred was despised by Aunt Mimi and was despised by his son John. They thought he was just a loathsome creature. And yet, for their authorised biography, Hunter Davies had tracked him down and interviewed him. And Fred's statement about what happened, and bear in mind, he's one of only 2 living people because Julia had died by then. John was the other one, who knew what was actually happening at that meeting. And Aunt Mimi, who'd sent Julia, would have got a reply. So she's a tertiary source, but she's a close one because she would have a direct report from Julia. And so Aunt Mimi, who was very censorious, and it looks like, it makes her look awful, makes Fred look awful, makes Julia look awful, and makes John look like a victim. She was happy for this story to stand. John, who was there, was happy for this story to stand. It is an absolutely turning point in his life, and yet Mark Lewisham ignores it. And he goes after the friend who couldn't even remember whether John Lennon was in the meeting or not, and couldn't hear anything. But he says, there wasn't any hullabaloo. Well, Fred didn't say there was. They were just having a talk, and then they got John in. And so he mocks the official story, which is 2 primary sources, John and Fred. And I look at it and I think, well, you can't mock that. You've got to have extremely good reasons for not going with that story. He doesn't provide it. The same thing, the way he denigrates George Martin and his handling of the issue of Stuart Sutcliffe's death and the injury. He could have done better on that. He doesn't do terribly, but he doesn't do well. But he does terribly on George Martin. He does terribly on John Lennon. And you get these stories that are just not good. And so someone who wants to read that book should read other Beatles books first, so that they can navigate through the problematic conclusions, but not the facts, because the facts are brilliant. And that's him. He's the most interesting of the tertiary sources. And we've already seen you can't trust Steve Turner or Ian MacDonald when they write about them, and they are extremely well regarded, and they are, and deservedly so. But even they can't be trusted. Can you trust John Lennon's best friend, Pete Shotton, when he talks about John? And he talks about his life growing up with him. He knew him from when he was about 5. Outrageous things, things people as adults have good cause to be embarrassed about. Can you trust him? Absolutely yes. Because Ray Coleman's biography, where he interviewed a whole lot of other friends of John's to get their stories, absolutely correlates to Pete Shotton's. From those two, you get a rounded, congruent view of what John was like growing up. So you can, and that's what you need to do for all these people, ask that question of trust before you use them. Now here's some fun about the Beatles as sources, because the Beatles never talked about their music until right at the end of their career, when John had released Revolution, and in 1969 he had to explain the line which goes, "When you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out?" That's in the single. But on the video for the single it goes, "When you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out in?" And the same thing goes for the White Album version of Revolution, the slow version, that you can count me out in. So an explanation was required. He literally set himself up for that. That's when they started talking about their songs, right at the end, January 1969. But this is how they were like before then. This is an interview in their 1966 tour of the United States. I'd like to direct a question to Messrs. Lennon and McCartney. A recent article in Time magazine put down pop music and referred to Day Tripper as about being a prostitute and Norwegian Wood as about a lesbian. I want to know what your intent was, authorial intent, when you wrote those songs. And what is your feeling about Time's criticism about the music that is being written today? Now that is a really intelligent question. George answered, because his sardonic tendencies, just the Beatles knew he'd handle it the best, and he just said, "Well, we're just trying to write songs about prostitutes and lesbians, that's all." And it's hilarious. But that's about as much information as you got from the Beatles. Now we're going to find that as we go through the Beatles, starting from early 1964, pretty much January actually, Bob Dylan starts becoming a major part of their story, far larger than you would expect. So we need to know, can you trust Bob Dylan when he talks about his songs? And here's him from a Playboy interview in 1966. They ask him, "Do you know what your songs are about?" Because his songs in that days were so weird and so crazily imaginative. "I do know what my songs are about," he says. And so Playboy says, "And what is that?" And Bob replies, "Oh, some are about 4 minutes, some are about 5, and some, believe it or not, are about 11 or 12. Can you be a bit more informative? Nope. So don't go looking to Bob Dylan to explain his songs. We have historical method and literary analysis, but we can't look at him as a source to explain what's going on. Not at all. The song that's about 11 and 12 minutes just came out at that time. It's from his brand new album of the day, Blonde on Blonde, and it's the last song, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, and it's 11 minutes and 22 seconds. So now to the Beatles and specific examples of how untrustworthy they are when they talk about their songs. On the jacket of his authorized biography, Paul writes a long justification for it, because obviously it has major ethical questions, given that John doesn't have a right of reply because he's dead. And he said this at the bottom of his justifications: "I find it very gratifying that out of everything we wrote, we only appear to disagree about 2 songs. Well, Paul, those would be Nowhere Man and In My Life, the only 2 songs you gave John the opportunity to disagree with during his lifetime. All the others are subsequent, and that is the nature of Paul. We only appear to disagree about 2 songs. It's pretty low. And I am a Paul McCartney admirer, but egos get in the way when Paul talks about his music and his relationship with John Lennon, as they do with John Lennon. So the transformations in the Beatles, all statements of 2, including their last album, Abbey Road, and including the autobiography, are we're all chummies, we're a great team, we work together, we're close as, John Lennon, oh no, we were tearing each other apart, we were rivals, and I was much more important than the others. And then the Beatles after John's death, especially Paul, in his authorized biography and in the anthology and in the lyrics, Paul says, we were much more cooperative than John said we were, for very good reasons, because, as we will see, Paul needed to rebalance John's statements. So I've written an 80-page mini thesis, actually, on why we can't trust the Beatles when they talk about their songs. The first one, the obvious one, is the delays. John starts talking about their songs for the first time in December 1970, and he's going back all the way to things that were written pretty much 1957, so 13 years ago. That's the very first time they talk about their songs, really. The second is evasion. This is mainly an aspect of George. George likes to talk about his religious songs, and when he does so, he's deeply informative. It's always useful to read what he says there. But when it comes to something personal, he's much more of a private person and often doesn't tell you anything or anything meaningful. An exception is Wah Wah, where he describes the song as relating to the Beatles. His first 2 important songs are on Rubber Soul. One of them is called Think for Yourself. It's a great example of George not prepared to tell us what's going on, because it is addressed to a specific person whose attributes George does not like. When he comes to talk about it in his autobiographical I Me Mine, he says, I can't remember who it was about. Probably the government. Well, the government's an institution, not a person, so it was definitely not about the government. To think that George has forgotten one of his really breakthrough songs, maybe, but that's a characteristic of him. He evades those kind of questions. The third area where we can't trust the Beatles is simply memory failure. John frequently said, I can't remember. A great example is when, in the 1970 Rolling Stone interview, Jan Venner, the editor, asked John about Rubber Soul, and John didn't know which album he was referring to, and he said, was that the one with the white cover with the drawings by Klaus Voormann? No, that was Revolver. Jan was really surprised. He said, can't you remember? That was Revolver. And he said, no, I can't. I've forgotten it all. It's all gone. I don't remember things like that. So Jan was astonished, and anyone who reads it is, because that was about 4 years earlier. With Paul, it's a slightly more complicated thing, because sometimes when he's forgotten, he just makes up a new story. A great example is the song Jet from 1973. In 1974, in the Paul Gambaccini interviews, he and Linda said, we have a light tan Labrador, and one day when she returned from roaming the streets of London, as dogs used to do in those days, she came back and gave us a litter of pitch black puppies. We had 7, and Linda corrected him, 9, or maybe it was the other way around, I can't quite remember, but however the number, they kept 1 and called it Jet. And so we can see why in the song the father was Sergeant Major because he got things done, and the mother was a bit of a lady suffragette because she was of a somewhat liberal disposition. And now we understand why Jet gets into the back of the car for a ride. That's exactly what you do with a dog. However, in 2019 to GQ magazine, and then again 2 years later in his book The Lyrics, Paul said, oh, I can remember distinctly writing that song. I was in my farm in Scotland. I was on these beautiful rocks and looking out at the sea and all that sort of stuff, and I was thinking about my brown and white Shetland pony, picture supplied in the lyrics. So I wonder how that pony gets into the back of the car for a ride. And that's Paul's memory. He doesn't say he's forgotten, he just invents a new story. A fourth area in which they show that they're not great sources in terms of trustworthiness is deliberate omission. You might say, Bob, how do you know that they've deliberately omitted telling us something? And I do know because they didn't tell us for like 55 years or so, and then in 2021 they suddenly give us a brand new story which gives the song a real clarity. And there are two great examples in there, Lady Madonna and Your Mother Should Know. Your Mother Should Know is the one I'm going to talk about. In his new account he says, it was in my drug phase, my LSD phase, which started in March 1967 and ended then in November. And Auntie Jen came to visit me in London from Liverpool, and she was the delegate from their family. Her job was to try and talk Paul into backing off from using heavy drugs. And it was a touchy moment, and she must have said words to the effect, your mother would know. And Paul went down while she was there and composed the song. And now we think we know why Paul stopped taking LSD. It was probably that delegation by Auntie Jen, his most beloved aunt. There is no reason for not telling us that earlier, because in Anthology, Paul and George and Ringo go into great depth to explain their use of LSD and what it did to them and how it changed their perspectives and things like that. There's no reservation in Anthology, so we all know that the Beatles used LSD quite extensively. Paul was the last to get into it, and that's also explained there. So why not tell us about when Paul stopped? We know when George and John stopped. It was when Maharishi came and said, you don't need drugs to see God, to experience transcendental nature. You can do it with meditation. My meditation, transcendental meditation. Now we know what caused Paul to stop, but why not tell us? Another aspect of the Beatles where we can't trust them is reconstructing the past. Now, this is common to just about all people. That's a filtering process, and it's done automatically as well as deliberately. You forget things and you filter things because you want to tell the story that you want to own. The past isn't necessarily all perfection. John Lennon has said this in the most definitive way. In fact, every historian could quote this little statement by John, which he made to the Hit Parade magazine in 1972, and he repeated, I think, on the Tonight Show or the Mike Walsh Show or whatever it was, when he was standing in for 5 weeks in New York City in 1974 or 75. Anyway, this is the statement. The past we remember is the past we create now because of the necessity of the present. It's amazing. I'll give you an example, again in Paul. In 1984, to Playboy, and it always seems to be Playboy, he is asked about John Lennon and heroin and how it impacted him. And Paul and Rinda both replied, oh no, we didn't know what was going on in their lives. It really was a mystery to us, so we didn't know. No. That's what he said then. 13 years later, in his authorized biography, he said, oh, John was on heroin and it was bothering us because of the paranoia. It was like walking on eggshells. Everything was difficult because of the heroin. And then he started to put heroin terms in Beatles songs like fixes and monkeys. And whereas the Beatles had put drug messages in their songs before, it was always very subtle, whereas now it was obvious and about something rather disturbing, and we didn't like it. So it's a complete change in 13 years between, oh, we didn't notice it, to, oh, we were walking on eggshells, all the paranoia and accompanying trouble. The sixth way in which we struggle with the Beatles as sources, just to take everything for granted, is ambit claims. Both John and Paul are guilty of this, and I'll just give you another Paul example. We know this we can see, we can prove this ourselves, you don't need me. If you watch the Get Back videos, Peter Jackson's Get Back, pretty early on they start working on One After 909. And Paul says to John, I never worked out what that was about. And John says, yes, I never told you. And then Paul says, so? And John says, I wrote that when I was 17. Paul says, amazing, or words to the effect, I'm just going from memory. And then Paul and George start having a chat about it, and George ended up persuading himself, with John just laughing, that the song means nothing at all. He says, well, it's okay just as long as the things are popping along. And so we know, absolutely certainly know, that Paul had nothing to do with the lyric, nothing at all. He didn't know what it was about. John said, I wrote that when I was 17. And yet, in every account, from the authorized biography to the Let It Be liner notes for the special edition, every account you can find, Paul says, we wrote it together. We wanted to write our own freight train song. We were thinking about British Rail. No, actually, it was more like the Omaha Express. We have freight trains, British Rail or Omaha Express, he says. He can't work out which, because he actually doesn't know anything about the song. In fact, if Paul's watching this, he's going to learn just how clever and entertaining John was when he wrote that song. And its focus is definitely not on trains. He got the number wrong. So have fun. It's not going to be long, because we were looking at that one in 1963, at the same night that the Beatles recorded From Me to You. These are the general reasons why the Beatles are difficult sources, but there is a much more specific reason that overrides everything, and that is John Lennon and Paul McCartney have very different views of what the Beatles' legacy should be. For John had been bruised by Paul, because from the end of 1965 onwards, with We Can Work It Out, having huge success in both the UK and the US. And in the US, the A's and the two, it was a double A with Day Tripper, and they were tracked together. And Day Tripper didn't even make to number one, and We Can Work Out was weeks and weeks at number one. And then after that, Paul dominates the Beatles commercially. John actually has another double A misfire with Strawberry Fields Forever against Penny Lane. Penny Lane gets to the top. I think Strawberry Fields gets to number 8. The Walrus is just a B-side. They're not even going to release it as an A-B with Hello Goodbye. And Hello Goodbye has the longest of any song, shared with From Me to You and I Feel Fine, at number 1 in the UK. So it's a huge hit for them there. And throughout the period till the very end of the Beatles, John has 2 hits that make the top. One is All You Need Is Love, fantastic song, and another is The Ballad of John and Yoko, which didn't make it to the top 5 in the USA, but did make it to number 1 in the UK. So Paul outclassed him commercially then, and then he continued to do that in a much greater degree in the solo years. So with John Lennon was 3/4 of the Beatles, essentially. He founded the band, he gave them the magic. Everything that they succeeded is really essentially because of John. He's the creative genius in the Beatles. And this is the thing that niggles Paul, because Paul, although he's the most successful Beatle both in the Beatles and after in terms of commercial success, he's not perceived as the genius, as the creative genius of the Beatles. And so he addresses that by saying, well, we were much more cooperative than John ever said. And he has claimed a whole list of songs to be co-written, which when we look at it, we think that they're written by John. So, for example, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Paul claims that he wrote Cellophane Flowers, and that's a key concept in the song. He becomes more assertive in his co-written claims as the decades progress. And we can't verify them because John is dead and he can't defend himself, and that's the nature of it. I'm going to close this section with the saddest statement made by any Beatle, and it's by John. Sad in the terms of it's so disappointing to hear John talk such nonsense, and really it's awful. So John in 1980 was being interviewed by Playboy magazine, by David Sheff. They were talking about the co-written songs, and John starts off positively, or it seems. We wrote a lot of stuff together, one-on-one, eyeball to eyeball, like I Want to Hold Your Hand. I remember when we got the chord that made that song. We were in Jane Asher's house, downstairs in the cellar, playing on the piano at the same time, and we had, ooh, you got that something. And Paul hits the chord, and I turn to him and say, that's it. I say, do that again. In those days, we absolutely used to write like that, both playing into each other's nose. We spent hours and hours and hours. We rode at the back of vans together. We wrote She Loves You in a van on the way to Newcastle, and From Me to You. So Playboy then, enthused, asks, do you ever feel that you've missed him artistically, musically? And John says no. I mean, we worked together partly because of the demand on us was tremendous. They'd want a single every 3 months, and we'd do it in 12 hours in a hotel or a van. So the cooperation was functional as well as musical. Playboy not happy with that? Ask him. And you don't think that that cooperation, that magic between you, is something you've missed in your work since? And John says, I never actually felt a loss. Well, if you know how to read now and then, you'll find that that is not true. That is absolutely not true. And now we're going to close this half of how do you analyze Beatle lyrics. And next week we'll look at the literary side, how you look at it as a point of literature. If you liked this video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more, both hit the subscribe button and notify to be told when I post new videos. I thank you for your attendance and look forward to seeing you again.